Hey everybody, this is a piece called The Changing Goals of Socialism in the 20th Century by Iring Fetscher. It was funny because today I was doing some dishes and I was listening to some of my old recordings and I had one by Iring Fetscher called it's like the concretization of freedom, Marx's concretization of freedom or something like that. And I kept calling him Irving, but it's Iring. So that's funny. Actually, let's see. Oh, you know what? Let's see what the Google Translate has to say. Iring.
Iring.
Iring. Fetscher.
Iring Fetscher.
All right. Well, anyway, this piece is called The Changing Goals of Socialism in the 20th Century. So here we go. There is no agreement on what to call, quote, socialism, end quote. So to make my theses unequivocal, I shall propose a definition of socialism which must be justified by what follows. By socialism, I mean a social order in which men are satisfied with their occupations, their, quote, praxis, end quote, and are able to live together peacefully, a, quote, association of free people, end quote, ruled neither by bureaucratic political institutions nor by the so-called, quote, objective laws, end quote, of economy. An order where everyone experiences the others not as a limitation but as a supplementing and enriching of his own life. The new order of property, at least the most important means of production being public property, while considered a means to achieve our end, a socialist society must not be confused with this end. There are forms of public property which, compared to capitalistic conditions, fail to improve either the producer's relations to their work and to nature, or their relations to fellow men. Nor must we misunderstand the idea of, quote, liberating the productive forces from the fetters of capitalist production relations, end quote, in the reified sense which has recently been criticized by Moishe Pistone. Moishe Pistone was Iring Fetscher's student in Germany. Footnote. Moishe Pistone's Necessity, Labor, and Time, a reinterpretation of the Marxian critique of capitalism, Social Research 45, 1978. So, it'll take him a little bit longer to get that book out, Time, Labor, and Social Domination, which was in 1993, I believe. A central statement of this analysis, which is brilliant in every respect, says, quote, if a central determination of capitalism is that social production is for the sake of production, whereas the individual labors in order to consume, capitalism's negation should be characterized as a social formation in which social production is for consumption, whereas the labor of the individual is sufficiently satisfying to be pursued for its own sake, end quote. Moishe Pistone. What Pistone questions above all is the view of socialism, which consists in a, quote, linear continuation of the industrial mode of production to which capitalism gave rise, end quote. Pistone. On the contrary, Pistone's conception of socialism, based on careful reinterpretation of Marx's text, above all Grundrisse, is predicated on the proof that a socialist society must be different from capitalism, above all thanks to a different kind of non-alienated labor. I agree with this view completely. End footnote. Real emancipation. The aim of socialism means liberation of the individual human being and of his diverse potentialities. His, quote, productivity, end quote, is to be liberated from the distorting constraints of class society and of, quote, objective, end quote, economic laws. And don't let us misunderstand the aim of achieving total, quote, equality, end quote. The point is precisely not to have everybody be, quote, the same, end quote, not to level down all people, a charge raised against socialism for years, but, on the contrary, to have all those highly different individual abilities and qualities fully unfold, so that all together will receive benefit and happiness from this diversity. In describing this kind of socialism, I have borne in mind our experiences with pseudo-forms, those now called, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote. An expression used by Rudolf Barrow in The Alternative, a critique of actually existing socialism. I did not know that Barrow is where that word came from, which embarrasses me. Changes within capitalist society, end footnote, changes within capitalist society that are, due to the competition and pressure of the, quote, socialist countries, end quote, as well as the continuing preponderance of the former, must also be taken into consideration. I shall divide my argument into a number of theses, each of which will start by pointing out a, quote, error, end quote, or a faulty prognosis made by the older socialism, and I shall then present a criticism, which can often be traced to Marx himself, of these errors and a statement on the lasting significance of the socialist goal. 7 errors. First error, public ownership of the means of production, the guarantee of freedom. According to the older socialism, public ownership of the means of production will in itself guarantee the emergence of a, quote, free association, of free producers, end quote, administration of things, end quote, will put an end to the domination over persons. If, however, the state is not structured democratically, and bureaucratic elites reserve to themselves the definition of, quote, common weal, end quote, or public interest, then public ownership in the forms of state property, instead of being a means of liberation, will turn into a tool of additional domination. As an example of such societies without private ownership of the most important means of production, Marx has examined the, quote, Asiatic mode of production, end quote, even if the relevance of the, quote, half Asiatic, end quote, prehistory of the Soviet Union is controversial. It remains significant that Marx himself felt that a combination of public property and despotism was quite conceivable and had occurred in history. As long as the discrepancy between needs on the one hand and goods and services for consumers on the other persists, quote, administration of things, end quote, will always imply domination over the persons to whom those things are allotted. As a matter of fact, a, quote, administered economy, end quote, will tend to abolish even those relative superficial freedoms that are rendered possible by free choice in the marketplace. In one of his preliminary studies to Das Kapital, Marx referred to this, quote, liberating, end quote, character of commodity production and of money wages paid for the commodity, labor power, the worker is no longer dependent to me. I guess this is a quote. I don't know if this is a quote or not. I don't know. Let's see. There's no quote, so I'll assume it's not a quote. The reason I'm thinking there's a quote is because it's like, I don't know, there's the 2 dots on top of each other. I can't think of what the hell they're called right now. The worker is no longer dependent on a particular master, while depending on the class of capital owners in the class of capital owners' entirety. The worker can, quote, freely choose, end quote, his master within narrow limits. Okay, I don't think it was a quote, so never mind. The money wage, again, in certain limits, allows the worker, quote, free choice, end quote, between various consumer goods, and moreover offers an incentive to thrift and self-discipline. For this reason, wage labor is more productive than slave labor, or the bonded peasant's labor. Indeed, for former slaves and bondsmen, the transition to wage labor means, quote, progress, end quote. Though not for the formerly self-employed, they lose their independence through the concentration process of capital. In many cases, even though in formal legal terms, they may stay independent. Public ownership of the means of production, therefore, can lead to socialism, only if it is administered by the producers themselves, that is, if the planning of the collective production is done democratically. The, quote, administration of things, end quote, is not a purely technical, non-political matter. The, quote, administration of things, end quote, requires democratic control in its turn. Democratic planning and control of this kind, however, are feasible only if complete freedom of discussion, of organization, of publication is guaranteed. As Rosa Luxemburg emphasized back in 1918, under socialism, the achievements of the bourgeois democratic revolution will by no means lose their importance. In fact, the achievements of the bourgeois democratic revolution will be much more indispensable. Footnote, quote, without general elections, without unrestricted freedom of press and assembly, without a free struggle of opinion, life dies out in every public institution, becomes a mere semblance of life in which only the bureaucracy remains as the active element. Public life gradually falls asleep. A few dozen party leaders of inexhaustible energy and boundless experience direct and rule. Among them, in reality, only a dozen outstanding heads do the leading, and an elite of the working class is invited from time to time to meetings where the elite of the working class are to applaud the speeches of the leaders and to approve proposed resolutions unanimously. At bottom, then, a clique affair, a dictatorship to be sure, not the dictatorship of the proletariat, however, but only the dictatorship of a handful of politicians, that is, a dictatorship in the bourgeois sense, in the sense of the rule of the Jacobins. Yes, we can go even further. Such conditions must inevitably cause a brutalization of public life, attempted assassination, shooting of hostages, etc. End quote. Rosa Luxemburg, The Russian Revolution. End footnote. The apolitical sphere of the market relations will disappear. Democratic policy making attains universal importance. Incidentally, some countries of, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote, precisely in order to soothe the population's discontent about the lack of political freedom, have allowed market relationship to be wide and within their centrally planned economy, which thereby became considerably more flexible and efficient, yet especially Yugoslavia and, in 1968, the beginning of a new economy in Czechoslovakia and the Hungarian economy today. I missed a footnote. I thought it was the end of the footnote, but it wasn't earlier. This is Rosa Luxemburg continued. Quote, Lenin says the bourgeois state is an instrument of oppression of the working class, the socialist state of the bourgeoisie. To a certain extent, Lenin says, the bourgeois state is only the capitalist state stood on its head. The socialist state is only the capitalist state stood on the capitalist state's head. This simplified view misses the most essential thing. Bourgeois class rule has no need of the political training and education of the entire mass of the people, at least not beyond certain narrow limits. But for the proletarian dictatorship, that is the life element, the very air without which it is not able to exist, end quote. Rosa Luxemburg. New section. End footnote, new section. Second error, humanist universalism. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, but also Rosa Luxemburg and V.I. Lenin, were convinced that after the socialist proletarian revolution, the age of national autonomy and particularity would come to an end. Stalin, in one of his last works, proposed a kind of scenario for overcoming national particularities. In large, quote, language areas, end quote, Russian and English respectively would become the predominant media, and possibly Chinese in a third part of the earth. The eventual outcome in the distant future would be a uniform world language. Footnote, Joseph Stalin, Marxism and Linguistics. Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin agree that a marginal language and culture like Yiddish, a stigma of a, quote, ethnic class, end quote, fallen behind, would vanish under socialism. Many Jewish intellectuals quite agreed. Today we know that national particularity, nay national independence, are of preeminent value even to the people of the countries of, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote. Quote, socialist internationalism, end quote, so often heralded, has much less binding power, insofar as socialist internationalism is more than a mere euphemism for the Soviet Union's hegemony within her sphere of influence, than emphasis on national independence and particularity. This development has, I believe, shown up an error that was committed not only by Marxism but, long before, had been held in common by enlightened modernism. For Marx, the terms world market, world literature, world revolution carried fascinating prophecies. When the Communist Manifesto described how the bourgeoisie created a, quote, world in its own image, end quote, those descriptions were by no means meant to be skeptical, polemical, as one might like to believe reading them nowadays. Footnote. Quote, the bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. To the great chagrin of reactionists, it has drawn from under the feet of industry the national ground on which it stood. In place of the old wants satisfied by the productions of the country, we find new wants requiring further satisfaction, the products of distant lands and climes. In place of the old local and national seclusions and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations, and as in material, so also in intellectual production. The intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible. And from the numerous national and local literatures there arises a world literature. The bourgeoisie, compels all nations on pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. The bourgeoisie compels all nations to introduce what the bourgeoisie calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, the bourgeoisie creates a world after its own image, just as it has made the country dependent on the towns, so it has made barbarian and semi-barbarian countries dependent on the civilized countries, nations of peasants on nations of bourgeois, the East on the West, end quote. Marx and Engels, Communist Manifesto. Marx was fascinated by the worldwide community created by capitalism in search for trade. Meanwhile, not just, quote, romantics, end quote, perceive the enormous price exacted by these processes of assimilation and leveling. All the world over, national cultural peculiarities are being degraded into, quote, folklore, end quote. The products of autochthonous folk art are losing their inner tension and credibility. Traditional life forms are being destroyed. A worldwide culture of asphalt, concrete, automobile, and industry is expanding. Looking out of the window, one can barely tell where one is. In Tokyo or New York, in Vienna or Frankfurt, in Paris or Manchester, in Nairobi or Sydney. This may be an aesthetic culinary viewpoint, but for the residents of those countries there is something terrifying about the threatening loss of visible symbols of their national identity. The movement to protect old residential neighborhoods and cultural landmarks in Western Europe, even if only 70 years old, is owed to this fear of losing national identity. Nations that in the course of their history often were threatened by overwhelming neighbors, that lost their independence, like the Polish nation, grasp the importance of symbolic objects of national identity sooner than others whose awareness is only just beginning. Socialists, however, have to recognize the importance and legitimacy of natural cultural particularity, and they will find it quite possible to tie this notion in with certain insights of the young Marx. They must learn to transform humanist universalism into humanist pluralism. In nature, the ability of all species to resist and regenerate is founded on their wide diversity. In a similar way, the strength and vitality of mankind depends on the profusion of individual cultures and nations. True, the capitalist industrial civilization has bestowed on mankind enormous progress in, quote, dominating nature, end quote, whose problematic aspects we shall have to examine more closely in our next thesis. Still, we dare not overlook the way it has inhumanely and on a global scale leveled and destroyed particularities. I do not mean to deny other nations the right to adopt European and North American science and technique. I do suggest that these achievements should be adopted in a way that pays respects to each nation's needs, traditions, and particularities, and allows it to maintain them. Marx still described with much ambivalent enthusiasm the dynamic of expanding capitalist industrialism. With its cheap cotton production, he said, it had raised Chinese walls. Today we see these things much more critically and skeptically. There is legitimate resistance to this expansionism which has, quote, marginalized, end quote, half the globe. This resistance will not prevent workable and reasonable progress so long as, in the nation's interests, it selectively and productively adopts whatever is useful rather than what the industrial metropolis happens to produce for export. Thus, the socialist world would be precisely ununiform and unhomogenized. It would not just tolerate and respect national particularities, but encourage them outright. Quote, world literature, end quote, too, would mean nothing else but innermost sympathy and variety of, quote, national literatures, end quote. Communality within diversity would increase their richness, and assimilation of foreign culture would be left to choice. Third error, uncritical egalitarianism. Certainly not Marx, but some socialists felt that all men were the, quote, same, end quote, and that individual differences were merely regrettable results of unequal conditions. It is certainly true that the great differences between adults of the same age group are largely the effects of their social environment. Way back, Adam Smith and Immanuel Kant emphasized the differences between a day laborer and a philosopher are due much more to the different vicissitudes of their lives than to their original abilities. Quote, in the progress of the division of labor, the employment of the far greater part of those who live by labor, that is, of the great body of the people, comes to be confined to a very few simple operations, frequently to one or two. But the understanding of the greater part of men are necessarily formed by their ordinary employments. The man whose whole life is spent in performing a few simple operations, of which the effects too are perhaps always the same, or very nearly the same, has no occasion to exert his understanding, or to exercise his invention in finding out expedients for removing difficulties which never occur. He naturally loses, therefore, the habit of such exertion, and generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. The torpor of his mind not only renders him incapable of relishing or bearing a part in any rational conversation, but of conceiving any generous, noble, or tender sentiment, and consequently of forming any just judgment concerning many even of the ordinary duties of private life. Of the great and extensive interests of his country he is altogether incapable of judging, and unless very particular pains have been taken to render him otherwise, he is equally incapable of defending his country in war. The uniformity of his stationary life naturally corrupts the courage of his mind, and makes him regard with abhorrence the irregular, uncertain, and adventurous life of a soldier. It corrupts even the activity of his body, and renders him incapable of exerting his strength with vigor and perseverance in any other employment than that to which he has been bred. End quote. Adam Smith, Inquiry into the Origins and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. End footnote. This, however, does not mean that under the same equally optimal conditions people would become, quote, completely the same, end quote. It simply means that all could fully unfold their abilities, however dissimilar and multifarious. Up to now, this dissimilarity and variety has been discredited, because this dissimilarity and variety was used to legitimize domination and exploitation. The qualities most highly prized were different in the feudal age: courage, physical strength, different in the age of early capitalism, an enterprising spirit, inner-worldly ascesis, is that a word? Askesis, the practice of severe self-discipline. And again, different in late capitalism, organizational gifts, unscrupulousness, etc. Many of these qualities had to be, quote, bred in the first place by the prevailing social order. But unfortunately, the countries of, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote, are, quote, breeding a number of rather negative qualities too. Adaptability, cynicism with regard to conviction, truckling to one's boss, etc. Under truly free conditions, this breeding of negative, asocial characteristics would vanish, but by no means would there arise perfect, quote, homogeneity, end quote, of the individuals. Creative and intellectual, physical and mental properties would be different as before. We may even assume that this diversity, which constitutes a society's wealth, would fully unfold only then, because it would no longer be covered up by the egalitarianizing varnish of qualities bred by the social institutions. To put it into a slogan, not socialism but capitalist industrial society levels people down, makes them similar to each other, robs them of a large part of the individuality and creativity which they all once as children owned. Fourth error, scientific technical progression. The idea of progress, which socialism inherited from Enlightenment and bourgeois society, has several roots. First, the modern experience of man's power over nature, which grew with scientific insight into nature's causal structure. Then the collective experience made in the French Revolution of the possibilities of liberation from traditional political power relations and ideological fetters. But progress concepts are joined in socialism. Both progress concepts are joined in socialism. In Marx, at least in Marx's intentions, the second is dominant. He began his criticism by showing the limits of the middle class emancipation movement. That was in italics. Limits of the middle class emancipation movement, which had abolished feudal inequality before the law, but neither the inequality of opportunities in bourgeois society nor the alienation of labor or everyone's dependence from, quote, objective, end quote, social economic laws. The socialist revolution was to supersede the merely political liberation by human liberation. Human liberation. Human liberation means two things. On the one hand, freeing the association of producers from the economic laws operating behind the producers' backs. On the other, freeing individual, quote, praxis, end quote, the individual's productivity, which is being distorted by the pressure to do alienated work in the service of capital accumulation. For Marx, to be sure, society's growing productivity, which under capitalism appears in the false shape of the productivity of capital, was an essential premise for the future actual liberation. As early as in Engels' thinking, even more so in Lenin's and Antonio Gramsci's, and quite unadulterated in Stalin's, the socialist conception of progress has been narrowed down to rising productivity of society as a whole. Eventually, Stalin reduced this purpose of socialism to one function, quote, freeing the productive forces from the fetters of the capitalist way of production, end quote. No longer interested in liberating the productivity of the individual by emancipating the individual from alienated labor, Stalin merely wanted to raise production, as evidence for all to see in the tonnage statistics. In the end, the industrial backwardness of Russia resulted in one assignment to socialism, to, quote, catch up with and overtake, end quote, the production of the developed capitalistic industrial countries. The qualitative differences had been given up. The decisive, quote, advantage, end quote, of socialism was seen to be the more economical use of social resources in the planned economy. Apart from the fact that so far this thesis has hardly been verified, with this priority of mere quantitative progress, the real purpose of socialism got lost. As a matter of fact, neither the products articles of individual and social consumption, nor the working conditions in the countries of, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote, compare favorably with those in the democratic states among the countries of industrial capitalism. It is true that a large part of the products sold in the capitalist market satisfy needs that have been artificially created, or compensate for the malaise that results from the social conditions. In their statistics of success, economists count all production alike as positive achievements, even if the products only compensate as best they can for the negative consequences of industrialization. As, for instance, the breathing mask distributed in Japan as protection against automobile exhaust gases. If the Soviet Union builds more vehicles that resemble, down to the details of their appearance, the status symbols of American managers, it may be permissible to draw inferences on certain similarities in the social structures. If increases in the productivity of labor are not used to improve the working conditions, or to reduce the working week, but, just as in the West, to increase the production of goods, especially of weapons, then one may conclude that the producers themselves have not been consulted about the production goals, and their enlightened interest has not been considered any more carefully, rather less carefully than in the West. Footnote: in Italy, Raniero Pansieri, I have a piece from Pansieri on this channel against the critique of objectivity of production or something like that. Anyway, in Italy, Raniero Pansieri has said that, quote, the capitalist use of the machine is not just a distortion or deformation of an objective development of technology that in itself is rational, but the capitalist use of the machine determines the direction of technological development. Determines the direction of technological development, end quote. Technology, therefore, is not neutral vis-a-vis the order of society and economy, but determined by the latter. So he defines the revolutionary potential not as mere, quote, progress, end quote, not as discovery of a hidden rationality of the modern process of production, which has been deflected by capitalism, but as the ability to, quote, build a radically new rationality that is opposed to the rationality of capitalism, end quote. Pansieri. The socialist use of machinery, one must conclude, implies a different concrete form of technology. End footnote. Since the state socialist and capitalist modes of industrialization are too similar, the ideologies which dominate, though they may not have been declared officially, are rather similar in both camps. Since the present is unsatisfactory, the people are constantly referred to future progress. So, since qualitative progress in the direction of more self-determination and democracy is excluded, because it would deprive the ruling elite of power, the only progress left is in the area of consumption. Workers and employees are kept in line by hopes of higher rewards in the future. This is true of both the Soviet society and Western industrial societies. Hope helps the majority to cope with the burden and sadness of the present. It compensates for the unsatisfactory reality of daily work without meaning, alienated labor, and similarly banal, quote, leisure time activities, end quote. Social inequalities in both bureaucratized Soviet society and the Western industrialized society are made, quote, bearable, end quote, through the hope of individual advancement or at least a future increase in consumption. This hope is illusory because many of the accepted goods have value for the individual merely because they are available only to the few. Their, quote, usefulness, end quote, resides essentially in their, quote, exclusiveness, end quote. See footnote, Fred Hirsch, Social Limits to Growth. End footnote. A steadily increasing proportion of consumption goods consists of status symbols and prestige articles which necessarily lose their significance the moment they are mass-produced. The privileged strata, however, in both societies oppose any dismantling of the hierarchical pyramid of incomes and lifestyles. Even though in the countries of, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote, some of the economic privileges are carefully shielded from public view, there are no statistics of income, no survey of the number of domestic employees of the leading cadres, etc. People know enough about them to resent them in the same way as they do in the West. Only repeated promises of future increases in consumer satisfactions are able to make the population accept these differences. With resources limited and above all with the shrinking frontiers of the environment, such promises of, quote, infinite progress, end quote, must needs become less and less realistic. Unless they wish to commit collective suicide by destroying the environment, both social systems will have to correct their, quote, progressism, end quote. In place of infinite progress towards more and less meaningful consumption, progress must be directed toward meaningful forms of activity and of leisure. Qualitative progress such as the utopian socialist Charles Fourier and the young Marx had envisaged. It is by no means necessary to renounce progress as such, but only that progress, which is self-defeating anyway, that consists in linear increase of production and of the mass of commodities for its own sake. Nor is a new, quote, ascesis, self-discipline, indicated, but certainly a dismantling of the social hierarchy, which usually awards greater opportunities of consumption to those who already have the advantage of more pleasant and more meaningful work in comparison with industrial and farm workers. Footnote. See Karl Friedrich von Weizsäcker. Karl Friedrich von Weizsäcker. As social inequalities are reduced and all are given the opportunity to engage in work that is meaningful and earns recognition, the manic race for maximum consumption is bound to disappear. There's a quote from Cornelius Castoriadis that's something like, socialism is in a luxury state next to an alienated workplace or industrial prison or something like that. Like the means of human emancipation is not merely increased access to use values in consumption. Back to the text. At least by implication, Marx indicated the socialist society would have to consider one of its more important purposes to be the adjustment of production to the, quote, needs, end quote, of renewing nature, both material and human nature. Footnote. Quote, capitalist production, by collecting the population in great centers and causing an ever-increasing preponderance of town population, on the one hand, concentrates the historical motive power of society. On the one hand, it disturbs the circulation of matter between man and the soil, i.e., it prevents the return to the soil of its elements consumed by man in the form of food and clothing. It therefore violates the conditions necessary to lasting fertility of the soil. By this action, it destroys at the same time the health of the town laborer and the intellectual life of the rural laborer. But while upsetting the naturally grown conditions for the maintenance of that circulation of matter, it imperiously calls for its restoration as a system, as a regulating law of social production and under the form appropriate to the full development of the human race. In agriculture as in manufacture, the transformation of production under the sway of capital means, at the same time, the martyrdom of the producer. The instrument of labor becomes the means of enslaving, exploiting, and impoverishing the laborer. The social combination and organization of labor processes is turned into an organized mode of crushing out the workman's individual vitality, freedom, and independence. The dispersion of the rural laborers over large areas breaks their power of resistance, while concentration increases that of the town operatives. In modern agriculture, as in the urban industry, the increased productiveness and quantity of the labor set in motion are bought at the cost of laying waste and consuming by diseased labor power itself. Moreover, all progress in capitalistic culture is a progress in the art, not only of robbing the laborer, but of robbing the soil. All progress in increasing the fertility of the soil for a given time is a progress towards ruining the lasting sources of that fertility. The more a country starts its development on the foundation of modern industry, like the United States, for example, the more rapid is this process of destruction. Capitalist production, therefore, develops technology and the combining together of various processes into a social whole, only by sapping the original sources of all wealth, the soil and the laborer. End quote. Karl Marx, Capital, translated by Samuel Moore and Edward Aveling. End footnote. It's a very long footnote, but I think it's a good one. A truly socialist society will not know any constraint to steadily and blindly increase. What? A truly socialist society will not know any constraint to steadily and blindly increase its capital and the mass of its products. The relationship of the associated producers to nature and to each other can change only after all privileges, political as well as economic, have disappeared and such working conditions have been created that everybody can find satisfaction in his occupation and through it. Charles Fourier had too simple a conception of this purpose. He assumed that for each necessary activity there was a, quote, passion, end quote, that corresponded to that necessary activity, and the only problem was to match that passion and that necessary activity so that the, quote, chaos of civilization, end quote, would be overcome by a harmonious order of society. It is necessary to elucidate the realistic nucleus of Fourier's approach, to which Marx and Engels already have pointed, and to make it the starting point of a truly humane restructuring of society. As long as, quote, unattractive work, end quote, exists, those who undertake that unattractive work must be given incentive compensation. Those who already enjoy satisfactory work, and work that is today preferred because of our scale of remunerations, must not receive such compensations. The more, quote, expensive, end quote, such unattractive work, the greater would also be the incentive for society to use technology to make it easier and more pleasant. As long as, quote, simple unskilled labor, end quote, is the cheapest, even a planned economy will have an incentive to reduce many occupations to this status or to keep them there. The fact that only a fundamental change in lifestyles can give meaning to a socialist revolution has been recognized by some followers of Georg Lukács, the Budapest School, among others. Footnote. See Agnes Heller, The Theory of Need in Marx, published at St. Martin's in 1976, and Henri Lefebvre's older works, The Sociology of Marx, published in 1968, and Everyday Life in the Modern World, 1971. End footnote. Their insights are of central importance for Western socialists too. Only a fundamental qualitative change in everyday life can liberate man from alienated labor and reified relationships. Without such liberation, it is impossible to stop the development of a consumer society whose compulsion to grow threatens life, or else it can be ended only at the price of the strictest bureaucratic regimentation. Wolfgang Hartg seems to be prepared to pay this price, and he thinks that it would be easier to tolerate the countries of actually existing socialism, end quote, whose population is already used to tutelage, than for the countries of the West, end quote. Wolfgang Hartg was a philosopher and journalist in East Germany. A deserter from the German army in World War II and a member of the Socialist Unity Party of Germany, Wolfgang Hartg became a professor of philosophy at Humboldt University in 1949. Hartg was arrested in 1956 and sentenced to 10 years in prison for the, quote, establishment of a conspiratorial counter-revolutionary group, end quote. Hartg was released in 1964 after 8 years and rehabilitated in 1990. In 1994, he joined the Party of Democratic Socialism. Wolfgang Harich's grave is preserved in the Protestant Friedhof 3 der Jerusalems und Neuen Kirchengemeinde. Cemetery number 3 of the Congregations of Jerusalem's Church and New Church in Berlin-Kreuzberg, south of Hallesches Tor. So that's who Wolfgang Harich is. Wolfgang Harich seems to be prepared to pay this price, and he thinks that it would be easier to tolerate for the countries of, quote, actually existing socialism end quote, whose population is already used to state tutelage, than for the countries of the West. Footnote. That's from Wolfgang Harich, Kommunismus ohne Wachstum. Democratic socialism has been remarkably flexible in its devices. The Swedes, whose foreign policy in office was most radical to the, quote, left, end quote, have been rather slow in adopting nationalization and planning, or even industrial democracy. Their aim has been to equalize incomes while allowing the free market to maximize total income. This policy was favored by an extraordinarily fortunate geopolitical and economic position. In Italy, by contrast, the Socialist Party of Italy insists on nationalization of electric power as a condition for joining the national government, a policy which the Prussian Social Democrats had followed quietly without ever boasting that they were introducing, quote, structural reform, end quote. The Austrian socialists are in power but do not introduce those, quote, structural reforms, end quote, which they declare are necessary. End footnote. Here another correction of vulgar Marxist cliches: as necessary if socialism is to have a future. In this respect, it will be possible to quote, besides Marx, also modern thinkers such as Walter Benjamin, who about 40 years ago uncovered the ambivalence of progression in the labor movement. Footnote. Quote, nothing has corrupted the German working class so much as the notion that it was moving with the current. It regarded technological developments as the fall of the stream which it thought it was moving. From here it was but a step to the illusion that the factory work, which was supposed to tend toward technological progress, constituted a political achievement. The old Protestant ethic of work was resurrected among German workers in secularized form. The Gotha program already bears traces of this confusion, defining labor as the, quote, source of all wealth and culture, end quote. Smelling a rat, Marx countered that, quote, ... the man who possesses no other property than his labor power must of necessity become, quote, the slave of other men who have made themselves the owners, ... end quote. However, the confusion spread, and soon thereafter Joseph Dietzken proclaimed, quote, the savior of modern times is called work. The ... improvement ... of labor constitutes the wealth which is now able to accomplish what no redeemer has ever been able to do, end quote. Joseph Dietzken. This vulgar Marxist conception of the nature of labor bypasses the question of how labor's products might benefit the workers while not being at their disposal. It recognizes only the progress in the mastery of nature, not the retrogression of society. It already displays the technocratic features later encountered in fascism. Among these is a conception of nature which differs ominously from the one in the socialist utopias before the 1848 revolution. The new conception of labor amounts to the exploitation of nature, which with naive complacency is contrasted with the exploitation of the proletariat. Compared with this positivistic conception, Fourier's fantasies, which have so often been ridiculed, prove to be surprisingly sound. According to Fourier, as a result of efficient cooperative labor, 4 moons would illuminate the earthly night, the ice would recede from the poles, seawater would no longer taste salty, and beasts of prey would do man's bidding. All this illustrates a kind of labor which, far from exploiting nature, is capable of delivering her of the creations which lie dormant in her womb as potentials." End quote. Walter Benjamin, Theses on the Philosophy of History, in Benjamin's Illuminations. End footnote. The reduction of reason to, quote, instrumental reason, end quote, and the dropping of the concept of, quote, substantial, end quote, rationality is a theoretical basis of the development just described, inasmuch as for contemporaries in both East and West, reason has become more and more a synonym of the structural principle of the scientific technological world that dominates life. There arises in both areas the real danger of a counter-movement which would be both reactionary and hostile to science. Such tendencies are expressed at least partially in the views of Paul Feyerabend, whose anarchist, quote, theory of knowledge, end quote, amounts to a total arbitrariness of the ways of knowledge. Paul Feyerabend, Science in a Free Society, and Against Method, Outlines of an Anarchistic Theory of Knowledge. End footnote. Such fads express the deep disillusionment of people who until recently had been looking for the solution of all their life problems through the triumphal march of science and technique. Faced with this crisis of the idea of progress, Theodore W. Adorno called for a critical reflection of reason on itself, the only way to set rational limits to instrumental reason. Footnote. Quote, "We are wholly convinced, and therein lies our petitio principii, that social freedom is inseparable from enlightenment. Nevertheless, we believe that we have just as clearly recognized that the notion of this very way of thinking, no less than the actual historical forms, the social institutions, with which it is interwoven, already contains the seeds of the reversal universally apparent today. If enlightenment does not accommodate reflection of this recidivist element, then it seals its own fate. If consideration of the destructive aspect of life if consideration of the destructive aspect is left to its enemies, blindly pragmatized thought loses its relation to truth. In the enigmatic readiness of the technologically educated masses to fall under the sway of any despotism, in its self-destructive affinity to popular paranoia and all uncomprehending absurdity, the weakness of the modern theoretical faculty is apparent." End quote. Horkheimer and Adorno, Dialectic of Enlightenment. End footnote. It is difficult, however, to define the content of a substantially rational order of human community life, because the historically deformed agents could not achieve it without making arbitrary decisions, and also because a society composed of equally legitimated members tolerates no elite which could introduce such an order by dictation. Jürgen Habermas has proposed to arrive at statements or ethical behavior in forms of social organizations that will be verifiable and binding by appealing to the universal equality of rights and freedom from domination that is structurally inherent in human language. Unfortunately, this presupposes the constitution of that society which he is trying to derive. It is not possible to show why everybody should respect the equality or reciprocity implied in language. Nor can a moral obligation be based on the argument that one who would use the language to refuse this cooperation would contradict himself. There is no obligation for anybody to be consistent. Fifth error: dogmatism in the philosophy of history. Since Friedrich Engels, socialism has thought of itself as scientific. It believes it can prove that the irresistibly maturing proletarian revolution must inevitably lead to a socialist world order. In spite of all modifications and qualifications in details, most orthodox and dogmatic Marxists to this day subscribe to this thesis. It is true that with Marx, the scientific nature of his criticism consists rather in the discovery of the inner contradictions in the capitalist mode of production, which bring forth tendencies transcending the status quo. His expectation that the labor movement, acting as an agent of these inner contradictions, would proceed to abolish the structure of this mode of production was never meant as an exact scientific prognosis, but rather as the disclosure of an objective possibility. Rosa Luxemburg condensed this historical alternative into the formula, quote, socialism or barbarism, end quote. Now, it is true that Marx did not subscribe to the so-called, quote, theory of immiseration, end quote, in the sense of an economic law reducing the living standards of the working class. But a great number of Marxists based their expectations of a future proletarian revolution on a real pauperization of the proletarian masses of the industrialized capitalist countries. These expectations have been decidedly frustrated. Any revolutions that so far have been successful in the name of Marxist socialism were aimed not so much as the abolition of the capitalist mode of production, but for all practical purposes, at the development of the industrial forces of production through the agency of a bureaucratic apparatus of direction, no matter how loudly the leaders of this apparatus claim to be Marxists. This observation certainly does not in itself refute the Marxist conception of historical development. Capitalism has conquered the world as Marx foresaw as early as 1848. It has created a world market and nearly everywhere has established the domination of capital, of dead past labor, over living labor. For all practical purposes, this capitalistic world system comprises the countries of, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote, as well. These may form among themselves their own international system, Comecon, but beyond that, they depend on economic relations with the capitalist environment, which in turn influence their domestic socio-economic conditions. It may be impossible to trace all the deformations and measures of repression in these countries of, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote, to the influence of the capitalist environment. But without any doubt, some specific characteristics of Soviet society can be derived from the fact that the socialist state had to assume the same function which, as 100 years ago, the Western industrial capitalist states had to fulfill, the disciplining of the farm population. The, quote, new French philosophers, end quote, who discovered the similarities in the methods and institutions of repression. In part, they gleaned them from Foucault's works. Footnote, Michel Foucault, Discipline and Punish, published with Pantheon, 1978, and Madness and Civilization, published with Vintage, 1973. End footnote. Are mistaken if they conclude that socialism has no value as a societal ideal. The right conclusion is that the so-called, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote, is no socialism at all, but greatly resembles a capitalism without democratic liberal traditions and without a class of private owners of the means of production. The Marxian philosophy of history had two main functions. One, to stabilize the labor organizations and to make the existing society tolerable to the workers. Second, to relieve Marxists of the need to describe the future society in concrete detail. They were content to know that socialism would overcome the unbearable sufferings of the capitalist system. Everything else could be left to those who in the future would build socialism. Those who believe in democratic socialism can no longer plead in this way. The material conditions of the workers in the highly industrialized countries are no longer so precarious that any change must be hailed as progress and liberation. On the other hand, the working and living conditions in the countries of, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote, do not appear attractive at all to the workers in the industrialized West. It is necessary, therefore, to determine much more specifically than was possible at Marx and Engels' time, the concrete shape of the socialist society of the future. Ernst Bloch may have felt something like this when he asked whether Marxists might not have gone too far on the road from, quote, utopia to science, end quote. A concrete utopia, a palpable model of the ways in which men and women in a truly socialist society would work and live, is sorely needed. This would turn socialism from, quote, a necessary product of the historical process, end quote, into a moral and political program. Such a change would have appeared to be a step backward, or even a weakening of the socialist idea in the eyes of the 19th century, which believed in capital P, progress and science, and did so appear in the eyes of Lenin. Today, I think it is indispensable. Against the derivation of the future socialist society from mere capital N necessity, based on the theory of history, Max Horkheimer argued that it is not sufficient to show how capitalism engenders socialism with the necessity of a law of nature, but that it is also necessary to show that socialism was qualitatively better. A moral valuation was always necessary, but the traditional scientific socialism did not envision and recognize it as a motivating force. The need for a humanist and democratic socialism in the sense defined above must be founded today on a renewed critique of capitalism, as well as of, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote, that addresses itself to the conditions of our day. The charge of democratic Marxism that from a certain moment on capitalism, because of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, no longer contributes to the development of the productive forces must be dropped, at least in its simplistic form. Rather, the charge is now that industrial capitalism continues to whip expanded reproduction into constant increases of the amount of merchandise, even when that development has become counterproductive and destructive of the environment. The insight that the worldwide expansion of this industrial mode of production, whether under the sign of capitalism or of state socialism, does not liberate but damages nature, and man forces us to formulate the critique as well as the concrete socialist alternative. The exploitation of the earth and the undisputed domination of man over nature can no longer, naively as Walter Benjamin said, be considered a complement to relations of solidarity between the producers. Indeed, the mode of production determines the relations of people to each other and vice versa. A truly thorough change in the mode of production, therefore, implies a change in the technique of production. Not, quote, technology as such, end quote, must be condemned, but only the specific form which technology is assumed under the conditions of capitalist economy, as well as the products which owe their existence, exclusively or primarily, to the race after surplus profit and its realization under the conditions of social inequality. In brief, instead of deriving socialism from historical laws that are as inescapable as the laws of nature, socialism must be shown as indispensable on moral grounds. Socialism is the aim of political efforts, not because socialism is bound to come with the inevitability of natural laws, but because socialism opens a humane third way rather than the insane alternative, either an economy of uncontrolled growth which destroys the environment, or bureaucratic regimentation of industrial growth. It must liberate human praxis from the alienating constraints that so far have hemmed human praxis in. Sixth error, the truncated view of man. The source of most errors in traditional socialism, as in most contemporary philosophies, is a restricted view of man. Marx quoted Darwin's expression, quote, a tool-making animal, end quote. But in his early works, he did not reduce man to tool-making. Rather, he understood him as a subject who realizes his own essence through the objectivation of his activities. However, much as the interpretation is to be preferred to the truncated one of, quote, tool-maker, end quote, it idealizes man and burdens man with exorbitant demands. Man cannot without qualification be viewed as the product of his own labor. By the way, in his critique of the Gotha program, Marx stated very clearly his view on man's dependence on nature. But in the tradition of modern philosophy, Marx did consider nature almost totally, quote, disposable and, quote, exploitable. And anyway, Marx never clearly elaborated on the limits of our ability to dispose of nature. Footnote, quote, labor is not the source of all wealth. Not the source of all wealth. Nature is just as much the source of use values, and nature is surely of such that material wealth consists, as labor, which itself is only the manifestation of a force of nature, human labor power, end quote. Marx, Critique of the Gotha Program, end footnote. Man, however, is dependent on nature in two ways. First, by man's own biological nature, and then by the natural environment he lives in. This, quote, unavoidability, end quote, Unverfügbarkeit of nature implies the moral obligation to preserve nature and to take good care of nature. Martin Heidegger expressed this opinion of nature being in a slightly mystifying metaphor when Heidegger called man the, quote, guardian of being, end quote. That's from a piece, footnote, Martin Heidegger, Holzwege. I don't know what that translates to. The, quote, turn in thinking, end quote, which is here alluded to, can more simply be called the recognition of man's dependence on nature. Sein. Nature is not at our disposal, to be arbitrarily manipulated, but demands care and cultivation, if nature is to provide the wherewithal for human life to the coming generations. Man is not the sovereign master of being, nature, but a piece of nature which may confront nature, but is also able to work in harmony with the laws of the earth as in a garden. This assignment requires him to place himself humbly under its command, instructed by those insights of science that do not serve the increase of domination over nature. Man is not a spirit to stand above nature, nor is man called, and by whom would that be, to be nature's master. Insight into man's subservience to nature implies acknowledging the limits of the aims man can realize, and the obligation to respect these limitations. But it is not sufficient to admit the natural conditions of human existence, which materialism ought to have seen anyway, and to draw the consequences from this insight. It is also necessary to take the emotional needs of men more seriously than so-called scientific socialism has usually done. People's emotional life cannot be reduced to the categories into which it is compressed, in the antagonistic class societies or in the hierarchical order of estates. Certain emotions such as jealousy, hate, distrust may disappear when these orders disappear, though this may take a long time. Other emotions which result from man's biological nature, from his helplessness as a small child, from his being thrown into the world, will continue to belong to man's makeup. Finally, since men exist as beings conscious of themselves, men need confirmation and recognition of their self-consciousness and their self-assurance. In this respect, it is not sufficient that each world citizen or world comrade is recognized as such by all others. For such recognition, which can be imagined only in the abstract, would not yield emotional satisfaction. People need recognition by their immediate peers and neighbors. This confirming recognition, emphatically also called love, can neither be ordered nor induced through intellectual arguments. It blooms only on the basis of an upbringing that strengthens the ego and avoids repression. Many Marxists, however, hold on to the illusion that the establishment of societal property would automatically result in the emergence of a new man. Finally, to recognize the emotional and unconscious aspects of human life means to make possible artistic expression free from all censorship. Man realizes himself not only through conscious intellectual and material activities, but also through his creation out of the unconscious. This is often the origin of the most important anticipations of future happiness and possible perfection. But it also produces the enlarged and heightened images of the suffering, sorrow, and need that may have been overlooked or misunderstood before. Both aspects are helpful to human society and to the individual creator, but precisely for this reason they must not be made serviceable. Only as a totally free activity can art become the organ of a new human orientation in the world. Seventh error. The industrial proletariat, the only agent of social transformation. The successful revolutions that claim to be Marxist may have, quote, theoretically, end quote, announced that the industrial proletariat was the revolutionary subject, but in practice, they were the work of revolutionary elites supported by highly heterogeneous masses of the underprivileged, peasants, farm workers, ethnic minorities, marginal people. Today, the organized industrial proletariat is not a revolutionary subject in the highly developed countries. The assumption that it would strive for socialism in the enlightened interest of its emancipation as a class has not been fulfilled in this form. Many members of the working classes today show behavior patterns and expectations that are more petit bourgeois than those of the new and old middle classes themselves. But above all, the focus of social distress in our society has been shifted from direct material misery to mental suffering. In the industrial countries, material poverty still exists in marginal groups, of which new ones are occasionally being discovered, but the majority of proletarians is not exposed to direct material want. Instead, precisely the upper strata of employees or quasi-self-employed are becoming aware of the meaninglessness of their own lives. The upper strata of employees and quasi-self-employed are conscious of being caught between alienated work for gain and commercially manipulated leisure time, which essentially serves only to increase the consumption of a growing production of commodities. Quote, to work more in order to earn more in order to consume more, end quote. To many, this injunction is no longer acceptable as meaningful. Awareness of this, which first broke through in the student movement of the late 1960s, is spreading among the majority of wage earners and salaried employees. So far, however, it has affected only parts of the industrial proletariat, especially highly skilled persons, those in the service industries, middle executives, etc. Herbert Marcuse must be credited with having recognized the importance of this movement, even though this movement's aims were often formulated unclearly, and of having related it to the socialist tradition. A similar awareness is being articulated in parts of the environmentalist and feminist movements. Footnote. See Rosemary R. Reuter, New Women, New Earth, 1978. End footnote. The capitalist societies and the state socialism which is more and more coming to resemble them are no longer rejected and opposed because they do not afford a materially satisfying life to the producers of surplus value, but because they force everybody except a diminutive stratum of capitalist moguls who can live on property rents alone to subject himself to alienated work at the service of an equally alienated and dehumanized consumption. With that, the social basis of a socialist transformation is broadened, which may increase its theoretical chances of success, though at the same time its heterogeneous character may prove a handicap to its practical organization. It is no accident that in this context the term cultural revolution has been picked up in the West. What is adumbrated here is indeed a sort of mass fight from the cultural ideal of industrial society and its valuation of industriousness, thrift, achievement, progressiveness. So far, most of those who identify with this movement know only what they are against, but scarcely what they are for. All too often one sees romantic and nostalgic projects whose failure then leads to deep resignation. Nonetheless, it is necessary to take these tendencies seriously as an indication that people are ready for a cultural revolution. It might well be that a new humane democratic socialism based on decentralized self-administered units with respect for national and ethnic particularities will arise as the focus of all these aspirations. New section. Summing up. Socialism can offer an attractive alternative to the currently existing industrial societies, whether capitalist or state socialist, and a model for the so-called developing countries, only if it is not content to nationalize the means of production, but places the means of production in the hands of producers who manage those means of production themselves. And also, if it provides a democratic balancing of interests between producer communities. It must also respect the national and ethnic idiosyncrasies and prevent the leveling tendencies of industrial capitalism, without, however, refusing to use the achievements of science and technology. Humanist socialism must not confuse the creation of equally favorable opportunities of development for all, on the one hand, and the imposition of absolute sameness on the other hand. On the contrary, only under a humane socialism would the individual talents and qualities of each be able to unfold freely. The ecological crisis has taught socialists that infinite progress of technological mastery over nature is not possible, and that what matters, therefore, is to find a qualitatively different lifestyle. A qualitatively different lifestyle, as well as different purposes, which should offer people a satisfying and peaceful life without the illusory hope of a steadily increasing consumption. The advent of socialism cannot be expected through a historical determinism which operates automatically, and the industrial proletariat of the developed countries is no longer the only agent of socialist perspectives. In its place and by its side, the masses of employees and pseudo-independents are trying to leave the meaningless cycle of alienated labor and alienated consumption. The limits of growth, on the other hand, force us to rethink the problem of happiness, or at least what men need to be satisfied. That is more than their daily bread, and different from it, even though a civilization that has sufficient resources must also, and first, provide for bread. The proper task of socialism, therefore, in the future will be mainly to make possible a quality of life in which each can find fulfillment through meaningful and satisfying activity, in the larger sense, including not only material production, but also solidarity, friendship, goodness, and, quote, service, end quote. Beyond that, it should be possible to develop the curiosity, the creativity, the emotional capabilities through a variety of artistic and scientific activities for their own sake, so that dependence on a materially limited environment is no longer experienced as restriction and limitation. Death and suffering will not disappear from the world even in an ideal, humane, and socialist society. But it will be easier for people to accept their finitude if they consider their lives meaningful and can expect for their children and future generations a similar fulfillment. Yet the bliss of a, quote, ideal society, end quote, will never be unclouded. It will be saddened by the memory of all the suffering, sacrifices, catastrophes, and crimes that have accompanied the path of mankind. No worldly thoughts and no social or political organization can provide consolation for this. Some may wonder why the countries of the Third World have been excluded from the sketch. The answer is, they may solve some of their short-term problems by emulating the model of, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote. But in the long run, they too must find those lifestyles which provide happiness and contentment on the basis of that daily experience, which I have outlined here. Beyond that, unless the advanced industrial countries take the lead on this road, it will not be possible to convince the elites and the intellectuals in the Third World that an alternative civilization is necessary for the survival of mankind in peace. An alternative civilization is necessary for the survival of mankind in peace. It should be noted incidentally and left to a separate discussion that the humane and democratic socialism of the future will have a lot to learn from the peoples of the Third World. For instance, the Sarvodaya movement in Sri Lanka. The hell is that? Wikipedia says that the Sarvodaya Shramadana movement is a self-governance movement in Sri Lanka which provides comprehensive development and conflict resolution programs to villages. The Sarvodaya movement is also the largest indigenous organization working on reconstruction from the tsunami caused by the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake. Founded in 1958 by A.T. Ariyatna, when he took, quote, 40 high school students and 12 teachers from Nalanda College, Colombo, on a, quote, educational experiment, end quote, to an outcast village, Kathalua, and helped the villagers fix it up. As of 2006, Sarvodaya staff people and programs are active in some 15,000 of 38,000 villages in Sri Lanka. The organization estimates that 11 million citizens are individual beneficiaries of one of its programs. The group distributes funds from a financial reserve bank of 1.6 billion rupees. The Sarvodaya movement belongs to the Global Eco-Village Network. So that's what the Sarvodaya movement is, and that's the end of the piece. It says that it was translated by Hedwig Pachter, or Hedwig Pachter. It looks like he looks like he's just a translator. He translated a book about the Sophie Scholl, who was a part of White Rose, the anti-Nazi resistance group in Germany. But yeah, thanks for listening.